Alright, so today we're going to be looking at a new project, a wizard-inspired pipe. This pipe is going to be both aesthetically pleasing as well as fully functional. This pipe will be able to smoke even the most magical of herbs. Here you can see a magical Opal Inlay right inside the walnut wood. Here's a closer look at the stem, along with the multicolored threaded braid that's used for the handle. Alright, so for this project I'm going to be using this block of walnut. It's really nice. I was able to get it from a local craft store. It was at a bag of other blocks of wood, so it probably cost about $1. You can see on one side I've marked out what I want the pipe to look like, along with the internal chambers that I'll be using as a guide for later. It's a beautiful piece of walnut. I'm really excited to be able to use it. First step is to take it over to the scroll saw. You're essentially just going to want to follow the guide that you drew on yourself, and just cut it all out, and get ready for the next step. This was a slower process than I expected just because of how hard walnut is. And I probably wasn't using the most optimal blades, but it did get the job done. It was just a bit slow. And at this point, you don't have to be 100% precise on any of these cuts. Just get it close enough to the line that you want. Keep in mind that any mistakes can be sanded down in the next step once we go to the belt sander. At this point, we just want to get something that's close enough to the shape that we're going for. We don't have to be perfect. The end result of the first step looks like. Sorry, it's a bit out of focus, but you can kind of get the shape there. The next step is to go over to our belt sander, and we're going to want to get a much closer shape to what we're actually looking for. I'm only working on the front face of this, so we're not going to be touching the sides or creating any bevels at this point. We just want to kind of smooth everything out, that way we can then drill our pilot holes that'll be used to connect the chambers to the stem. Alright, you're going to watch closely here, as this is a key step. You don't want to miss this. It can happen. There it goes. Okay, you're going to want to fling your project off the wall and onto the ground. Go ahead and inspect it for any damage that probably occurred. That is key. Make sure not to remove that footage from the video. And just continue on like nothing happened. Up next, we're going to be working on creating our chambers. So I had to pre-measure this out, and I marked it on a popsicle stick as to how deep this chamber needed to be. And then just using a drill bit, I was able to go in and just get the depth that I wanted. And you can just see I'm doing this slow and steady. I don't want to overshoot and then end up drilling through the bottom of this piece and then essentially ruining it. So we're going real slow just to basically sneak up on the perfect depth. Then once we have that, we can go into a much more fun stage. We can start creating the actual shape of our pipe. So here we're creating all the bevels, we're rounding this off, and we're inspecting it. So essentially you're going to be doing light passes and re-inspecting to make sure everything is aligned properly. Don't really want to rush this stage and just kind of enjoy it. So I'm taking advantage of all the different angles in this belt sander just to be able to get into all the nooks and crannies of this pipe. This is the first time I've used a belt sander, so there's probably some more efficient ways of doing all this. I'm just kind of winging it at this point. But honestly, I was able to get the shape that I wanted pretty easily. Nothing too hard. Did end up losing and throwing my piece across the room a couple of times, but I think that's just par for the course. Now we have our rough shape pretty much done. This does not need to be perfect. That belt sander is not going to be used to get us the final shape, just to get close enough to it. So here you can kind of see the pipe taking shape, and I went ahead and drew on a symbol in the front, something that looks semi-magical, something that a wizard may have on their pipe. We will be doing something kind of fun with this. I wanted to practice doing an opal inlay. So here what we're going to end up doing is taking a Dremel and just kind of going over the shape and just carving out a thin layer of the wood on the inside of it, which we'll then fill with opal dust. So one mistake that I did make here was not going deep enough with this engraving. I wanted to conserve my opal dust, but looking back I should have doubled the depth. I think that would have made a much better looking inlay. But all in all, it still turned out fine, so no worries, but it is my recommendation going forward that you should probably go as deep as you can with the materials that you have. That's what she said. So this is the first time I've tried doing an opal inlay like this. The steps are pretty simple. I'm going to be putting a small amount of super glue into the engraving, followed by a small amount of fine opal dust, just to fill it in. That opal dust should absorb this super glue, and once it hardens up, should be pretty nice to sand down and get into a pretty good shape. So I'm just going to follow that pattern of putting in super glue and then pouring on dust on top until we're all the way around the entire engraving. So here I'm just kind of turning it sideways and knocking off some of the excess dust. That way it doesn't build up too much and I don't end up running out. And then lastly, I'm going over the entire thing with just another layer of super glue. This is really just to ensure that everything gets covered. Once the glue is dried overnight, tried to let it sit for about 24 hours before touching it. I took my oscillating multi-tool over to it with some low grit sandpaper and just trying to remove the top layer of that opal. That way when we go to sand down the whole pipe, that won't just tear up all the sandpaper. You're going to want to go ahead and take like a Dremel and go ahead and widen the chamber to your desired size. I don't really know too much about pipes, so I just kind of eyeballed this and got it to a size that I thought would be not too big but not too small. I also attempted to have the chamber tapered at the bottom, so it's wider at the top and then the bottom kind of tapers down to where the main chamber connects to the stem chamber. For this next step, we're just going to take the pipe and we're going to sand it down, give it a pretty good approximation of its final shape. This is not going to be perfect, but the attempt is just to get it pretty close. The next time we go into sanding, we're going to be doing some much higher grit sanding, and so we want to go ahead and get this as close to the final product as possible before moving on. So just get it looking good. It doesn't have to be 100% perfect. We'll go ahead and do all that in the later stages where we buff everything out and make it look really nice. Your goal here is just to get it smoothed out and even. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to capture all of the stem making process, but I'll go ahead and explain it here. So this is a 2x4 that I drew the shape of the stem on, took it to the scroll saw and cut it out. From there I took some of the walnut wood that I had in a very thin slab, and I cut off just enough to make 2 sections of wood. So when I hold up to the camera, you'll see the 2 sections. I, using a table saw, cut out a channel in the center and then glued the outer edges together, soaked it in some water, and then put it into this press, getting it its curved shape, and let that sit for about 24 hours. You can see I put a string in here. That's just to make sure none of the glue fell into the center chamber. Take the stem over to the bandsaw and give it its rough final shape. This will help hide the fact that there's 2 pieces of wood glued together. By the time you get this all polished up, you won't even be able to see the separation. So we're going to smooth it out, so instead of it being angular, we want it nice and rounded. The belt sander made this surprisingly easy. I was able to accomplish this with almost no problems, so highly recommend using a belt sander such as this to do it. Lastly, you're just going to want to use your Dremel and just carve out a little interlocking channel there so that you can stick the stem into place, and then just put a little bit of glue on there to dry overnight, and then tomorrow it'll be one solid piece. Once the glue is dried, go back to your Dremel and flush up the 2 pieces of wood together. You could spend a lot of time here and make it nearly invisible, but since I'm going to be using a handle wrap, I don't want it to be completely flush because I'm going to have the wrap starting at this joining portion. Here is the final step before completion. We're going to be using some very high grit sandpaper. You can see in the background I'm currently at 5,000 grit, and applying some wax on here at the same time. Just going over and making sure this is as smooth as possible. We want to go for a glass-like finish on this wood. So take your time, use extremely high grit sandpaper, and just go until you feel really, really happy with the end result. off camera, I went ahead and took some cheap thread that I found at my local craft store that was colorful. I think it transitioned a couple colors. I went ahead and got that and did a wrap, something similar to a paracord bracelet pattern, and just slowly wrapped the handle with it because I wanted to give it some extra color and some separation. And here you go. You can see the end result. The opal inlay turned out very gorgeous, and the handle wrap pattern looks really cool. It was actually by accident, but I won't tell anybody that. All in all, this pipe, material-wise, probably cost me about $6 for the wood, glue, thread, and opal inlay. Very cheap to make as long as you have the tools available. So thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed.